In October 1982, a man named Brad arrived at the Annapolis dock in Maryland. Brad came to apply for a job on one of the ships being prepared to sail. There, Brad approached a captain named John, who looked very busy managing his ship's supplies. Brad greeted John and immediately stated his intention. Brad also reminded him that they had spoken on the phone before. John then came closer and started questioning Brad about his experience. Had Brad ever sailed this sea route? Brad answered no. Had Brad ever operated a new model ship? The answer was still no. John started to hesitate. John explained that he needed a truly professional crew because this ship had to be delivered to its new owner in Florida.
Anything else I should know? Party boat on a river? What? You have no experience.
Brad tried to convince John. Brad said that since he was a kid, he had grown up around the sea, so at least he understood how ships worked. Suddenly, a woman called out to John. The woman was Meg, John's girlfriend, and also a crew member. It turned out Meg already knew Brad and immediately begged John to accept him. Because of Meg's request, John finally agreed to hire Brad. Once on board the ship, and thanked her for her help. The other two crew members, Mark and Deb, also welcomed him. Not long after, the sailboat named Trashman departed heading south. John led his 4 crew members on the delivery voyage to Florida. Everyone had to be extra careful and adapt quickly. John began giving orders to the entire crew, including Brad, who was assigned to turn the winch for the sails. Soon after, John immediately criticized Brad because his movements were too rough and unskilled. Meanwhile, Deb, who was more experienced, worked neatly. Deb set up and adjusted the sails until everything was perfectly positioned, making the ship's speed increase even more. During the daytime, the crew gathered inside the boat to eat together. Meg, who was cooking, served the food, while Deb remained busy watching over the ship. At the dining table, Mark, who was also John's close friend, started talking about his personal life. Mark admitted he had trouble finding a partner, but recently he had met a girl who happened to live in Florida. Mark asked John to make a quick stop during the journey, so he could pick up the girl.
Why are you laughing? What's fun? First, I didn't say anything. Where is it going?
What about Beaufort?
So, Beaufort. Maybe we could go in, in a good time, and we could bring her back on the boat because
For John, the request sounded quite bold and unreasonable. They had already set sail. The food logistics were only calculated for 5 people, and extra fuel would definitely be needed if they stopped. As a friend, John politely refused. But the refusal immediately made Mark upset. In his anger, Mark took out his frustration on Brad by slamming a plate in front of him. Brad felt threatened. John just stayed silent watching the incident, then told Brad to respond by working better than Mark. John knew the other crew might not like the presence of a newcomer like Brad, but for Brad, the situation felt strange. As captain, John should have directly reprimanded and handled that kind of behavior. Even so, Brad decided to listen to John's advice.
All right, go on up. I was just testing.
The scene then shifted to the Coast Guard office in Charleston. The officers had just recorded a storm coming from the west. They didn't seem to expect the weather to be this bad. They quickly started monitoring the radar and watching the ships in the area. Night fell. On the boat, Mark had drunk too much wine and was heavily intoxicated. Meanwhile, John realized the weather was getting worse. John went below to ask Mark to secure the boat, but Mark was just lying there and started talking nonsense.
I need you to get it together, man.
John, maybe that's...
John, who was already panicking after seeing the weather report, immediately told everyone that a big storm was coming from the west. Mark, who was drunk, instead joked around and suggested that John delay the trip so they could stop by his acquaintance in Florida.
Are you this guy who's always in a rush,
John immediately got angry because Mark was only thinking about his own interests in such a critical situation, but he realized Mark couldn't be relied on. In the end, John told Mark to stay inside and watch the radio. Mark was asked to call John if any important notification came in. John then went back up and ordered all the crew to get ready because the weather was getting worse. At the Coast Guard office, the officers reported that 2 large storms were about to hit. They immediately sent emergency signals to all ships in the area. Ships that hadn't departed were advised to cancel their trips, while ships already at sea were asked to change course eastward to avoid the storms. All information, including coordinates and storm positions, was broadcast over the radio. Unfortunately, Mark, who was supposed to be watching the radio, had fallen asleep because he was heavily drunk. The important information was completely missed. On the deck, The crew was shocked to see the waves starting to grow rapidly. Meg quickly went down to secure the items, while John and the others tried hard to keep the boat steady. John called Mark several times to ask for news from the radio, but there was no answer.
We need help!
A few moments later, Mark came up with a confused look on his face, not understanding what was happening. John immediately told him to prepare the inflatable boat. Brad started lowering the sails. John went below to try contacting the Coast Guard via radio, while Deb took over the helm. But there was no signal coming in on the radio. In the kitchen, Meg tried to tidy up the items again, but the waves made everything messy again. It showed how little experience they had in dealing with emergency situations. Up top, Brad struggled to roll up the sails, which were becoming harder to control because of the strong wind. Luckily, John came back up, then Deb took over handling the sails. John told Brad to go below to help Meg. Down below, Brad saw Meg struggling to secure the items that kept falling. Brad gave Meg a clamping belt to tie down the important objects. But the waves were getting fiercer, and Meg was still having trouble. The oven cover suddenly fell and injured Meg quite badly. The wound was deep, making Meg hysterical until her screams could be heard all the way up. Brad immediately called John. John went down again and panicked when he saw his girlfriend injured. John asked how this could happen. Meg even blamed John. Brad apologized for letting Meg, who was inexperienced, handle it alone. John quickly grabbed the first aid kit and gave her first aid. Meanwhile, Brad tried the radio again, reporting that there was a seriously injured person and asking for help as soon as possible. After trying several times, the radio finally connected with the Coast Guard. John immediately reported that a sudden storm had hit their boat. One crew member was seriously injured, and they needed help as quickly as possible. They gave their position coordinates, and the officer there noted them quickly. The Coast Guard chief realized John's boat was right in the danger zone. Luckily, there were 2 cargo ships heading toward them. The Coast Guard told John to hold their position as best as possible because help would arrive in about 3 hours. But John refused. He thought it was too long. He asked for the fastest route to the nearest shore because there was a crew member dying and they needed a hospital immediately. The Coast Guard officer immediately stopped him. The storm was coming from the west, exactly from the direction of the shore, so heading there would actually be more dangerous. The call suddenly got cut off. John became even more worried seeing Meg's condition. After thinking for a moment, John decided to ignore the Coast Guard's advice. John told Deb to turn the boat toward the nearest shore. Deb, who was experienced, immediately refused, saying the waves were too big and could crash the boat. But John insisted. They needed a hospital right now. After a short debate, John took over the helm and turned the boat toward the shore. Deb then went down to take care of Meg. Deb asked Mark for help. But Mark just sat there silently in fear while staring at the increasingly violent waves. Luckily, Brad immediately helped. Deb tried to contact the radio again, but the boat had already turned and was now fighting the waves head-on. Not long after, a giant wave slammed hard into the side of the boat. The boat capsized. All the crew were thrown into the sea. After nearly drowning, they managed to surface one by one and tried to survive the continuous waves. Meg was briefly swallowed by a wave, but John quickly pulled her back. Luckily, they saw the inflatable boat not too far away. The 5 of them swam toward it. Now they could only wait. John was sure the evacuation team would come soon. Meanwhile, at the Coast Guard office, they would try to contact John because the 2 cargo ships from earlier hadn't found his boat when they passed each other. The Coast Guard chief realized 2 out of 5 ships had disappeared from the radar, including John's boat. They immediately sent a helicopter search team. On the first flight, the pilot reported they still couldn't see anything because the weather was still very bad. 6 hours passed. They were still drifting at sea. Meg kept moaning in pain because her leg was still bleeding. John, who was worried, hugged her tightly. Seeing the situation, Brad suggested that Meg get on top of the inflatable boat, but John refused. John said it was colder up there, and the cold air could speed up hypothermia. Meg, who was thirsty, tried to drink seawater. John immediately scolded her because it would only make dehydration worse and could endanger her life. Everyone started to panic and asked how far they had been thrown from their original route. Brad answered it should be around 2 miles, but in the last second the boat had suddenly changed direction, so Brad wasn't sure. John tried to calm the others. John said the Coast Guard already knew their last position. The evacuation team would definitely come in a few hours. The most important thing now was to stay patient and hold on, Not long after, Meg suddenly argued with Deb. Meg accused Deb of kicking her injured leg and told Deb to stop. Deb immediately denied it, feeling the accusation was ridiculous. How could anyone in a situation like this, after the boat sank, randomly kick their friend? John quickly told them to stop arguing. John asked everyone to stay calm so the situation wouldn't get any worse. But not long after, Brad felt something touch his leg. Not just Brad, all the crew felt the same thing. There was something strange under the water. Meg bravely looked down, and it turned out the blood from her wound had attracted a school of sharks. Meg immediately told the others. Everyone panicked and tried to climb onto the inflatable boat at the same time. Because of their own actions, the inflatable boat flipped over and nearly drowned all of them. With the boat flipped over, Mark immediately climbed on top. The others got angry and told him to get down, but Mark was terrified and refused. They explained that the boat had to be flipped back to its original position before the sharks attacked.
Get on! Get off! Stop! Get off the boat!
John immediately pulled Mark down. Mark nearly drowned because of it. They then tried to flip the inflatable boat. Although they had some trouble, they finally succeeded. One by one, they climbed up while the others kept the boat balanced. After everyone was up, only Brad was still in the water. At that moment, a shark almost snapped at him. Luckily, he managed to survive. Once everyone was on board, the problem wasn't over yet. The school of sharks started attacking the inflatable boat, making it easy to flip. John couldn't just stay still. John kicked the sharks to make them stay away. The method worked for a while, and the sharks stopped attacking temporarily. But not long after, one of the sharks rammed the boat hard. John was thrown into the sea. The shark immediately approached, ready to bite. Luckily, his friends quickly pulled John back up. After that, everyone fell silent for a moment, then started screaming in fear.
Noise in the movement.
John immediately told them to be quiet and not make any noise. Movement and sound could attract the shark's attention again. But Mark was hard to control. Mark kept whining in fear. John had to hold him to keep him quiet. Finally, after the situation calmed down, the sharks slowly left. Meanwhile, at the Coast Guard office, the rescue team had been formed. Helicopters started searching the ocean. The pilot reported that they had already found 16 boats, but there were still 27 people missing. The Coast Guard held another meeting to determine the unsearched search area, then sent a new helicopter.
Based on their last fact.
At sea, the crew had been drifting for a full 14 hours. There were still no signs of rescue. Either the rescue team had just started moving, or their position had drifted far from the estimate. The situation got worse under the scorching sun, with no shelter, no drinking water, and no food. John estimated, according to the wind direction and current, they were being carried westward toward the shore. If his calculation was correct, they might reach land in about 20 hours. John tried to comfort the others by telling them that many people had drifted at sea for weeks or even months but still survived. John asked them to stay strong and patient, because right now that was all they could do. John also became increasingly worried seeing the wound on Meg's leg starting to look infected. 31 hours had passed, and the situation was still the same. The infection in Meg's leg got worse. John decided to tie her leg with a belt so the infection wouldn't spread further. Mark briefly protested because he was worried her scream would call the sharks back, but John did it anyway for his girlfriend's safety. When the belt was tightened, Meg screamed in pain.
In trash and the...
Not long after, the sharks started approaching again. When the sharks shook the inflatable boat, Mark immediately protested to John. Mark said John's action was endangering everyone's life. John ignored the protest and continued tying the belt. John even almost fell because of the strong shaking. Meg, who couldn't stand the pain, finally untied herself. Mark grabbed the belt from John and threw it into the sea. John got very angry seeing that because the belt could still be useful. In his emotion, John attacked Mark and pressed his face into the water until Mark had trouble breathing. From afar, the sharks started approaching and were ready to attack. Luckily, Brad quickly separated the two of them and saved Mark. John then fell silent, lost in thought. John realized his emotions had become very dangerous. Mark, who was still upset, then criticized John. Mark reminded him that John was a captain. His job should be protecting the crew, not endangering them. John could only stay silent and reflect, feeling like he was a failed captain. Night fell. John stayed awake while the others slept. John started talking to himself. Clearly his mind was already starting to break down.
I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna slow down. I'm gonna get the beat around.
The next morning, while everyone else was still sleeping, John woke up alone and saw an island in the distance. Without thinking long, John immediately jumped into the sea and swam away from the inflatable boat. His friends shouted at him to come back. John answered that there was an island ahead. They warned him that it was only an illusion. Only then did John realize. John hurriedly swam back, but it was already too late. As his friend tried to reach his hand, a shark immediately attacked.
Get back to the boat! Hurry! Battle!
John was torn apart right in front of all of them.
Get back to the boat! Hurry!
Sometime later, the crew had been floating for 2 days and 11 hours without drinking or eating, a very long time. At this point, they were starting to have trouble thinking clearly. Deb observed the sea around them and told the others that the sharks had gone. Hearing that, Mark immediately washed his face with seawater to cool his body. Even though they knew it was dangerous, Deb and Brad eventually did it too. Not long after, Meg already looked very weak. The infection in her leg had spread widely and left her helpless. Brad stayed loyal, taking care of her, occasionally washing her body with seawater so she wouldn't get too hot. Because the thirst and hunger were unbearable, Mark was tempted to drink seawater. It was a very bad decision. Seawater only made his body more dehydrated and the thirst even worse. Even though it tasted very salty and torturous, Mark kept drinking a lot. The others tried to stop him and warned that drinking seawater could make him go crazy. But Mark no longer cared. His thirst was too strong, so Mark kept drinking without stopping. The next night, while the others tried to sleep, Mark suddenly started screaming for no reason. It was clear that Mark had started going insane and was hallucinating. Mark screamed all night until his friends covered their ears.
Stop!
Entering the third day, Mark became more chaotic and made everyone panic. Deb explained that this was the effect of drinking seawater. Mark was experiencing severe dehydration. Not long after, Mark suddenly stood up and started jumping on the inflatable boat. Everyone immediately got scared because the boat could flip. On top of that, the sharks started approaching again. Brad had no choice but to subdue Mark and hold him to keep him calm. Finally, Mark became somewhat aware and promised not to cause trouble again. But not long after, Mark went crazy again. Mark slept casually while dipping his hand into the water. That behavior immediately attracted the sharks. A shark ambushed Mark and pulled him into the sea. Mark should have been able to survive if he had gone straight back to the boat, but because he was no longer sane, Mark instead swam away. A shark immediately bit his body and tore him apart until he died in front of them. Now only 3 people remained until night fell. Meg called Brad and Deb. Meg admitted that her leg no longer felt pain, but her body couldn't be moved. Meg apologized for everything that had happened. Meg said John actually only wanted to save himself. Meg also talked about her wedding plans with John, even though in reality it was already different. Brad realized Meg was dying. Brad stayed by Meg's side all night. The next morning, Meg's body was already stiff and pale. Deb told Brad to throw her body into the sea before it started to rot. With heavy hearts, the two of them pushed Meg's body into the water. Not long after, the sharks immediately approached and ate the body. Meanwhile, the rescue team failed to find John's boat. The helicopters had searched the entire area, but there were no signs of them. In the end, the Coast Guard decided to tell the families that most likely the entire crew of the Trash Man had died. For days past, Brad and Deb were already suffering greatly from dehydration and hunger. Brad started to get sick, while Deb was still quite aware even though her body was also tortured. At that moment, Deb realized their inflatable boat was too wet inside. There was a mixture of blood and waste that could make their condition worse. Deb then told Brad to help her flip the boat. Brad briefly felt helpless, but Deb kept motivating him until Brad finally got up and helped. Brad looked hesitant to enter the water. Deb assured him that the sharks were no longer visible.
Okay, there's that. You ready?
The two of them then flipped the inflatable boat. After it was successfully flipped, Brad just stayed silent in the water with an empty gaze. Deb realized Brad was hallucinating. Deb quickly brought Brad back to his senses until Brad could help fix the boat's position. Once the boat was back to normal, Deb climbed up, but Brad again stayed silent in the water and started losing consciousness. Deb warned him that sharks could come at any time. Brad was already very weak and suddenly sank. While sinking, Brad regained consciousness, saw a shark approaching. In panic, he turned around and, with Deb's help, finally managed to climb onto the boat and survive. Almost exactly 6 days they had been floating. Both of them already felt there was no hope left. But not long after, Brad saw a Soviet merchant ship passing not far from them.
No, they don't.
Because they were too excited and afraid of missing it, Brad and Deb boldly jumped into the sea. Luckily, the crew of the Soviet ship saw them. They threw a buoy. Brad immediately swam toward it quickly, but Deb was exhausted and started sinking midway.
Hold on, Deb.
Brad immediately helped her, pulling Deb so they could swim together. The sharks started approaching again. Luckily, the ship's captain realized the danger and sounded the horn loudly to chase away the sharks. Finally, Brad and Deb were successfully evacuated. They had been carried by the current hundreds of kilometers away from their original route. In the closing part of the film, original photos of the two are shown. In October 1982, Brad and Deb were rescued by a Soviet merchant ship. The photo was taken by one of the crew members. They were then treated in the hospital for 8 days because they experienced severe dehydration and extreme hunger. After the incident, Deb managed to build a career as a book writer. Deb passed away in 2012. Meanwhile, Brad chose to stay in America with his wife and 2 children. Until now, Brad works as a captain on the same route as the Old Trash Man, the ship that once traumatized him. That's the story of this film. Well, what message do you think can be taken from this film?